Hello, I'm Liselle Sambury and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things writing and traditional publishing, including my own journey as an author. And today we are continuing the Save the Cat deep dive series. So if you don't know, this is a series which I will link down below that I've been doing where I make an individual video for each of the beats in the Save the Cat story structure. So this is a structure that was originally created by Blake Snyder. I learned about it by reading a book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which I will also link down below. And so I made this series talking about each beat in the structure and just kind of how I use it in my own writing and my own stories. And so this isn't prescriptive. I am not a Save the Cat expert person. It's really just like me sharing my own process with you in the hopes that it is helpful to you. So I would recommend watching this series from the beginning, but I am specifically talking right now about this beat, which is Bad Guys Close In, which is the second to last beat of the second act. And so that's what I'm going to be chatting about today. And so I'm going to go ahead and say the Save the Cat Writes a Novel description of this particular beat, and then we will jump into discussing it more. So it describes this beat as Bad Guys Close In provides a place for your hero to rebound after a false defeat midpoint or fall down after a false victory midpoint, all while the internal bad guys, aka their flaws, are closing in. And so that is the Save the Cat description, and then we're going to go ahead and go through how I use this beat. I'm going to start by talking about some of the challenges of this specific beat, because I do think this one has some unique challenges, and I also think that I am approaching it in my own writing in perhaps a unique way. So essentially, the biggest challenge for me about this beat is that it is huge. It is 25% of your book. 25% of your book. That's like, it's a quarter of your book. And it is generally very unspecific. So it kind of just says, you know, bad stuff happens. And so I've always found this beat to be difficult because it's kind of like, okay, well, that's not a lot to go on for 25% of the book. And so I will find when I construct stories with this particular beat, what I usually end up doing with it is that this becomes a continuation of the fun and games. So essentially, if you've watched my video about the fun and games, which I hope you've watched if you're watching this in order, I talk about how I use subplots to help me construct the fun and games. And so I use those subplots and I try and end about half of them before the midpoint, and I end the other half after the midpoint. So technically, the fun and games beat ends when you get to the midpoint. But I essentially, in my process, just kind of continue it. And so Bad Guys Close In to me is essentially just Fun and Games Part 2. And I've constructed that way so that I can continue to rely on subplots to help me give structure and to help me flesh out this beat so that I have a little bit more of something to go on than just kind of like things get worse. So it's kind of like, it's essentially like the unfun and games. Like, it's not a fun time because things will get worse, but I find that this at least helps give structure, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But I just wanted to discuss up front what I have always found to be difficult about doing this beat, in case this is also what you find difficult about this beat. Let's talk trajectory after the midpoint. So essentially, in that definition that I gave you from Save the Cat Writes a Novel, it talks a lot about like where you're gonna go based on the midpoint, and so that's how this beat is laid out. The trajectory of this beat is laid out according to the book, based on what happens at the midpoint. So if you had a false victory at the midpoint, you'll find that things are actually starting to get worse for your character, whereas if you had a false defeat at the midpoint, things will actually start getting better for your character. According to Save the Cat, However, this is not at all how I do it. I very much take bad guys close in to heart, and so things are going to get bad. I don't care what happened to you at the midpoint. It's not going to be great from here on out. And that's basically how I go about it. And this is because the next beat that comes in the Save the Cat structure is the all is lost moment, which is the rock bottom for your character. And so to me, the trajectory is actually, I am leading up to what is going to be the worst moment for my character. And so to me, I'm like, yep, just a steady downward dive from here. We're going on a little what is this, a triangle? A diagonal line. We're going from the midpoint and we're going down. And we'll come up later, but right now we're just a steady incline downwards and we're going that way. But not actually steady, because we still have that bouncing ball narrative that happens. So some good things can happen to your character, but for me, regardless of what happens at the midpoint, I'm doing a steady negative trajectory towards that all is lost moment. This means that I am choosing my all is lost moment ahead of time. So even though that is the next beat coming up, I essentially will hop forward to all is lost and I will decide what is going to be the rock bottom moment for my main character, so that then I can jump back into bad guys close in and I can have a trajectory. So I am going from wherever the midpoint is to this rock bottom moment. And so to give you an example, I'll use the example of the Hunger Games-esque thing that I've used a little bit in the past, in which you have a main character and a love interest who are forced to pair up to do this battle to the death, and the main character is like, I just need to kill all the people and then we'll win and everything will be okay. Whereas the love interest is like not super on board with like murdering people and is like, I wish there was some other way we could get around this. Okay, say this is the scenario. And so at the midpoint, the main character successfully kills someone. And that is to them a false victory, because they're like, yeah, I did it, murked them, great, we are closer to winning. But the love interest is very disgusted by this, very sick and very upset. And so that's what makes it a false victory, in that the main character has achieved this goal, but now the love interest is seeing them differently. So when I am going into bad guys closing in, I've decided the all is lost moment is that the love interest is just going to take off. They're going to be like, I don't want to work with you. You are very disgusting to me. You're a murderer and you're like happy about it, and that's really disturbing to me. I'm going to take off. I don't care what happens to me. We are not teaming up together anymore. So that's going to be the rock bottom moment for that character. And so I am leading to this. And so all of what is going to happen in the bad guys closing in is really going to be the deterioration of the relationship between the main character and the love interest because of what the main character did at the midpoint. And so now I have a trajectory. I know what I'm going to be working on. I know the main thread that is going to be kind of pulling the story, pulling the main character's journey throughout this. Because as I write my books, I'm very focused on the journey of the character versus the plot. And so that's why this is really like a character-focused sort of trajectory versus something plot-wise. Because at that point, the plot can service the main character's point of view in their trajectory. So perhaps, the plot is such that things keep happening that might push the main character to kill more people, which now they're kind of feeling weird and odd about. And so the plot really comes in to be in service of that character journey. Now you have the trajectory for this whole beat. You know where you're going to go. You kind of have that main thread of the all is lost moment and what you're leading up to. And now we're going to talk about incorporating that fun and games section, those subplots that I discussed earlier, because this beat is 25% of the book. Are you going to take up that whole 25% with the main character and the love interest having this back and forth all the way until the rock bottom moment? You could, but I think it's a lot more interesting for the reader to have those subplots in this second bit to help carry you through. So exactly as I said before, this is the continuation of the fun and games beats subplots, but in this case, I try to create an endpoint where I am ending the subplots right as the third act is about to begin, because when I go into the third act, I just want to be focusing on the main plot. However, caveat for that, sometimes there are subplots that will just naturally continue into the third act. For example, the B story, I technically consider a subplot, and that character relationship is probably going to carry through all the way to the end of the book. Or if you have like a mystery and you want to do like a final twist or something towards the end, mystery or thriller or horror, and you want to do an extra twist at the end, that mystery subplot might continue all the way until the end of the book so that you can get that twist in. So sometimes the subplots will continue into that third act. I just like to think of the third act as a stopping point so that I can decide if a subplot really needs to be going past there. Because if it doesn't really need to, if it's just kind of going to be a distraction to that wrap up, then I want to end it right as the third act is ending. And so that is basically the continuation of incorporating that fun and games section, is going into that and basically kind of taking those subplots, deciding where you want them to finish, and then using those subplots to help you in creating different things to happen in that section, because it's 25% of the book, and so you want something interesting, you want things to kind of help you bring structure to that section. At least for me, that's what I found helpful, and so those subplots can be something that can really help because they themselves will have their own structure that you can then add on to the main plot, so that you know, okay, I have all of these things, I have these, say, 2 subplots and the main plot to fill up this 25% of the book. And I know that I talked about this sort of trajectory and I did this very straight diagonal line gesture. However, that's not actually how this will go. So really you want to continue the bouncing ball narrative. You want the character to still have ups and downs. So it's really more like this up and down sort of waveform, but with a general diagonal leaning. I kind of think of like if the fun and games was like bouncing ball narrative with like a fully inflated perfect bouncing ball, the bad guys close in section is kind of like bouncing ball narrative but with like a deflated ball. Like it's not quite like the lows are lower, you're a little bit more upset, you're a little bit more frustrated, it's kind of not as fun as it was before, but you're continuing on with it because okay. And like sometimes you get a good bounce out of the deflated ball and you're like, oh my god, you're like so much happier because you made the deflated ball bounce, and then it comes back down and it lays flat and it's somehow even worse now. And so that's kind of how I try and think of the bouncing ball narrative going into the bad guys closing in. Like the highs, there's a lot more, I guess, sort of emotion attached to things that your character would have been excited about before, maybe even more excited, but also things that, you know, might have been like kind of frustrating for your character before, maybe quite a bit more debilitating this time around, is how I think about it. It's kind of the more emotional section. And for me, this makes sense because your main character at their midpoint, they start to question the things that they want and actually need. So the whole thing about the character, again, I talk about this, I have a video about creating complex characters where I talk about character wants and needs. And so there's something that the character wants to do, and then there's something that the character actually needs. And so that midpoint is that shift from want to need. So the character starts to really consider maybe what I want is not actually what I need, and they start to think more about that need, and that creates a lot of turmoil for them. They were already kind of doing this in the beforehand section, the way at least that I implement Save the Cat, but this is really where they become the most aware of it. So for example, with the example that we've been using of the Hunger Games style scenario, this character is now very aware of like the fact that like they kind of feel weird about having killed someone, and they don't know if that's something they want to go ahead with, and that's what they thought they wanted. And now these sorts of things are difficult for them, and it is awkward and is not the same. And also they're cognizant of the fact that the love interest is very upset with them for what they've done, and so there's a lot more hesitation and difficulty. So maybe, you know, they get into a fight and they're like winning, and like that should be the high, and they're like, yeah, I'm winning, and then they're like, oh my gosh, am I gonna kill someone again? Like, am I actually gonna do that? And so that creates turmoil, and maybe they lose the fight because of that. And now that loss is so extra crushing because they could have done it and they had the ability to win and they could have won, but they got messed up by this whole, you know, morality thing. And it made it difficult for them and they lost. And so the loss feels that much more stinging because I could have won, I could have won, I could have done it. But now I'm like messed up in my head, and this is making it difficult. And so that's kind of what I mean and what I'm talking about. Hopefully that is coming across correctly. But it's a different sort of bouncing ball narrative than what you would have done in Fun and Games. But it is that same similar. You want ups and downs for your character because that also creates interest for the reader. If things are just kind of only bad all of the time, it can kind of be a bit crushing, which some people might want that book, and certainly that book is fine, but it is kind of nice to keep readers guessing if you kind of give the character, like you throw them a couple bones, so that, you know, the reader can kind of be kept on their toes as to like how, you know, bad is this going to be. I also find that it makes the crushing low of the all is lost kind of worse if like some nice things happened, especially if a nice thing happened kind of right before all is lost. So those are things you can play with in that bouncing ball narrative. And finally, I want to talk about building to the all is lost moment. So we've talked already about having that trajectory of like getting to that moment, and it's been a very downward diagonal line sort of thing. But I also want to impress like building towards that moment, which is also something that I think about when I do this beat, and that helps me add structure to this beat, is I want to build to that moment. So if the all is lost moment is that a character is going to die, I'm going to make you love that character so much in this beat. I'm going to make them the most lovable character you have ever seen. I'm going to rip out backstory that's going to make you tear up, so that when you get to the all is lost moment, it hits like a punch to the gut. And if you've read books before, I'm sure you have felt this happening before. Like you've started to be like, oh my god, this character is the best. And then you start to get this creeping dread of, oh my gosh, are they gonna die? Because that is a thing you want to build to that moment in order to get that emotional payoff. And in the case of our example, with the love interest leaving them at that all is lost moment, you can build up the romance in that second bit. You can like have really important moments. You can build on how much the main character is like in love with this person, and how much they rely on this person, and how much this person has positively changed their life, so that when you get to the moment where they're like, enough, I'm leaving, you're not who I thought you were, it is that extra gut punch. Build to that moment. And again, this is why I find it to be so helpful to already have and already decide what that all is lost moment is ahead of time, because this will really help with that structure of what you're kind of getting to in that bad guys close in section. You can also do it a different way. You can also kind of have things get kind of progressively worse if you wanted to, and do it that way. So you might have them having more arguments, etc., and you can build up to it that way as well, which I think I talked about when I talked about the trajectory. I do think, however, when you do this kind of opposite technique, it can be helpful in kind of building that gut punch. But again, nothing is prescriptive. You don't need to do it, and sometimes for a story, something different might work better. It's really all up to you and how you want to go about that. And that's it for the bad guys close in beat. I hope that was helpful to you. I will again have links in the description for that whole playlist, and I believe the next video, the all is lost video, I will be putting out next month in August, so it should be coming pretty soon, and then that will wrap up the whole second act, which is really exciting. And then I think we really just have the finale left, right? Yes, that is correct, because Break Into 3 has already been done, so it'll just be the finale and then the end of this series. Though I'm still considering doing that video where I do the whole beat thing, just because I did a workshop, which I will link. I'm not sure if it's still going to be available at this time, but I did a workshop with the Fold about layered plotting and how I do all of that, and I had a full example. Because I had to create the full example, it is possible for me to use that example in order to go ahead and show kind of a full filled out beat sheet. So I may end up doing that. But yeah, so the next video will come at you in August. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!